On the crisp autumn morning of October 30th, 2006, the quiet suburb of Crestwood, New Jersey was shaken to its core. The sun had barely risen when the horrific news began to spread. Rachel Thompson, a 34-year-old homemaker beloved by her neighbors, had been found dead in her home. Her lifeless body, drenched in blood and lying in a disheveled living room, painted a picture of a crime fueled by intense passion and sudden violence, one that no one in the tight-knit community could have predicted. Rachel was a familiar face in Crestwood. Known for her warm smile and friendly demeanor, she was often seen participating in neighborhood events from bake sales to charity runs. Her husband, Mark Thompson, was equally well regarded. Mark was a man of routines and meticulous habits, an accountant by profession known for his obsession with collecting vintage watches. He spent his weekends scouring flea markets, estate sales, and online auctions in search of rare timepieces. To their neighbors, the Thompsons appeared to be the epitome of suburban bliss, devoted to each other, financially secure, and deeply involved in their community. The idyllic image of suburban serenity was violently shattered on October 30th, 2006, when the police arrived at the Thompson residence in Crestwood, New Jersey. What should have been an ordinary day for the Thompson family became a scene of horror that defied the peaceful reputation of the neighborhood. As officers and detectives entered the home, they were confronted with a chaotic and unsettling tableau. The living room, once a symbol of comfort and domestic bliss, had transformed into a nightmarish crime scene. Furniture was thrown askew, upturned in a violent struggle that had taken place. Blood was smeared across the walls and pooled on the floor, marking the site of a brutal confrontation. In the center of this carnage lay Rachel Thompson's body, her lifeless form stark against the blood-streaked carpet. Her head was disfigured, a ghastly testament to the savage force used in her murder. The gruesome sight was so shocking that even the most experienced detectives were momentarily at a loss for words. As investigators began their painstaking work, they noted the absence of forced entry into the home. This crucial detail suggested that Rachel's killer was someone she knew and trusted enough to allow inside. The lack of a break-in hinted at an insidious betrayal from within her circle, a betrayal that would soon become clear as the investigation unfolded. Among the most striking pieces of evidence was a blood-stained trophy lying near Rachel's body. The trophy, an ornate and heavy award from one of Mark Thompson's watch-collecting competitions, had been used with evident force. Its presence at the scene and its grim coating of blood suggested it was the likely weapon in Rachel's murder. Forensic experts quickly set to work examining the trophy for fingerprints and other clues that could lead them to the perpetrator. The results of the forensic analysis pointed to an unexpected suspect, Alan Parker. Alan, a 69-year-old retired engineer who had lived next door to the Thompsons for years, had been known for his passion for collecting antique clocks, a hobby he had shared with Rachel. This connection had initially drawn the two into a close, though clandestine, relationship. But now, his fingerprints on the trophy linked him to the crime scene in a most incriminating way. As the evidence mounted, detectives delved deeper into Alan Parker's background and his relationship with Rachel. They uncovered a web of deceit and infidelity that had been meticulously hidden behind the veneer of suburban normalcy. Rachel and Alan's affair had started innocently enough, with shared conversations about their mutual interest in timepieces. But as their relationship grew more intense, it became clear that the affair was more than just a casual dalliance. The emotional and psychological stakes had escalated, culminating in the tragic violence that had shattered the Thompsons' once idyllic life. The discovery of Alan's fingerprints on the murder weapon, coupled with the absence of forced entry, painted a damning picture of betrayal and violence. The investigation was now focused on unraveling the complex motives and emotions that had driven Alan to such a horrific act. The true nature of the crime, rooted in passion, jealousy, and a tragic love triangle, was beginning to emerge, revealing a dark underbelly to what had once seemed like a quiet, untroubled community. Alan Parker was a man who had largely kept to himself in the decade he had lived in Crestwood. A widower, Alan had retreated into a life of solitude after the death of his wife. He spent his days tending to his garden and working on his extensive collection of antique clocks, a hobby he had nurtured since his youth. It was this shared interest in timepieces that had initially brought Rachel and Alan together, setting off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The story of Rachel and Alan's relationship began innocuously enough. They met at a neighborhood gathering where Alan had struck up a conversation with Rachel about Mark's watch collection. Intrigued by Alan's knowledge of horology, Rachel had begun visiting him to learn more about the intricate mechanics of antique clocks. What started as casual conversations about their shared passions soon evolved into a deeper connection. Alan found himself drawn to Rachel's youthful energy and beauty, while Rachel, who had long felt overshadowed by her husband's obsession with his watches, was flattered by Alan's attention. Over the following months, their relationship blossomed into a full-blown affair. They met in secret, careful to avoid arousing suspicion in the close-knit neighborhood. Rachel's frequent visits to Alan's house were easily explained away as an extension of her interest in horology, and for a while they managed to keep their affair hidden from prying eyes. But as the affair progressed, the pressure on Rachel began to mount. She became increasingly paranoid, fearing that Mark would discover her infidelity. Mark, whose meticulous nature had made him a successful accountant, began to notice subtle changes in Rachel's behavior. She was more distant, less affectionate, and increasingly preoccupied. When he found an unfamiliar watch in her dresser drawer, a vintage model he knew wasn't part of his collection, his suspicions were piqued. However, he chose not to confront her immediately, instead deciding to keep a closer eye on her. The final unraveling of Rachel's life began on the night of October 29, 2006. Alan, who had grown increasingly frustrated with the secrecy of their relationship, had decided that the time had come to confront Mark. In his mind, the only thing standing between him and a future with Rachel was her husband. If Mark were out of the picture, Alan believed, they could finally be together without fear of discovery. It was a dangerous fantasy born of obsession, one that would soon turn deadly. Alan arrived at the Thompson home under the cover of darkness, knowing that Mark would likely be alone. Rachel had mentioned that she would be out running errands that evening, and Alan saw this as the perfect opportunity to confront Mark. He carried with him a knife, a weapon he had brought not with the explicit intent to kill, but as a precautionary measure, a twisted insurance policy in case things went wrong. When Alan entered the house, he found Mark sitting in the living room, engrossed in polishing one of his prized watches. The scene was almost surreal. Mark, completely unaware of the danger he was in, meticulously attending to his collection, while Alan stood silently in the shadows, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. What happened next unfolded in a matter of minutes, but its consequences would reverberate for years to come. Alan stepped forward, revealing himself to Mark. He tried to keep his voice steady as he began to speak, but the anger and jealousy that had been simmering within him for months quickly took over. He accused Mark of neglecting Rachel, of being so consumed by his watches that he had driven her into another man's arms. Mark, taken aback by the sudden confrontation, tried to reason with Alan, but his words only fueled the older man's rage. The argument escalated, and before Mark could react, Alan drew the knife and stabbed him in the neck. The moment Alan's knife made contact with Mark's neck, he was immediately engulfed in a wave of realization. As the blade sliced through flesh and muscle, Mark's body crumpled and blood began to pool around him. Alan stood frozen, his mind numb with disbelief as the gravity of his actions hit him. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. The reality of what he had just done crashed over him like a tidal wave, leaving him momentarily paralyzed with shock. Alan's thoughts raced, frantically trying to devise a plan to cover up the crime. Panic set in as he realized the enormity of his situation. He had not only taken a life, but had also left a bloody scene that would inevitably attract attention. Desperately, he dragged Mark's lifeless body through the house, his movements hurried and frantic. The backyard, with its shadowy corners and overgrown grass, became his makeshift graveyard. He dug a shallow hole, his hands trembling with both fear and exertion, and buried Mark in a hurried attempt to erase the evidence of his brutal act. Each shovelful of dirt seemed to deepen his sense of dread, but he was driven by a single thought: escape. He hoped that by the time anyone noticed Mark's absence, he and Rachel would be long gone from Crestwood. Later that night, as the shadows grew long and the quiet of Crestwood settled over the neighborhood, Rachel Thompson's return home was marked by a sense of dread that she could not shake. She had been expecting to find Mark, perhaps a little annoyed at his sudden disappearance, but ultimately hoping that his absence would be temporary. Instead, what awaited her was far more horrifying than she could have imagined. When Rachel opened the door to her home, the sight that met her eyes was both shocking and grotesque. The living room, which had once been a haven of comfort and warmth, was now a scene of utter chaos. Furniture was thrown haphazardly about the room, and bloodstains marred the walls and floor, painting a macabre picture of violence. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she took in the disturbing scene. Her gaze quickly fell upon Alan Parker, who stood amid the carnage, his clothes stained with the blood of his victim. Alan's appearance was both unsettling and incongruent with the man Rachel had known. His clothes were smeared with blood and his demeanor was tense, his eyes wide with a mixture of desperation and fear. The sight of him in such a state immediately sent a chill down Rachel's spine. The sense of foreboding that enveloped her was almost palpable, and she felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Alan, his voice shaking, attempted to explain the horrific details of what had transpired. He recounted the events with a trembling voice, hoping to convey the gravity of the situation and to justify his actions. Alan had anticipated that Rachel's reaction would be one of relief. He had hoped that she would see Mark's absence as a necessary step toward their happiness and be grateful that the obstacle to their relationship had been removed. But as Alan spoke, it became clear that his expectations were gravely mistaken. Rachel's reaction was one of utter horror and revulsion. As she listened to Alan's account, her face went pale and her eyes widened with disbelief. The realization of the bloodshed and violence that had taken place in her home was too much for her to process. She screamed, her voice raw and anguished, filled with a mix of disbelief, anger, and profound disgust. The words she used were sharp and accusatory. She called Alan a monster, her voice trembling with a potent mixture of fear and moral outrage. The intensity of her reaction was a stark contrast to Alan's expectations and hopes. In that moment, Alan's world began to unravel. The carefully constructed future he had envisioned with Rachel, free from the constraints of her marriage, was disintegrating before his eyes. The reality of her repulsion and the harshness of her accusation struck him with a force greater than he had anticipated. The guilt and rage that surged within him were overwhelming, and his composure crumbled under the weight of his actions. Alan had believed that removing Mark from their lives would clear the path to their happiness, but Rachel's reaction shattered this illusion. The rage that surged within Alan was a blind, uncontrollable fury. The emotional turmoil he experienced was compounded by the guilt of his actions and the betrayal of his expectations. Overwhelmed by a mix of guilt and fury, Alan's sense of reality became distorted. The plans he had made, the hopes he had harbored, and the future he had imagined with Rachel all disintegrated under the weight of his emotional collapse. In this fractured state of mind, Alan's rage found a new and horrifying outlet. The violence that had erupted earlier in the evening, which had claimed Mark's life, now took on a new dimension. Alan's anger, no longer directed solely at Mark but also fueled by Rachel's rejection, became a destructive force that led to a second fatal act of violence. This act sealed the tragic fate of both Rachel and Alan, transforming the evening's events from a single act of violence into a double tragedy. Alan's actions that night would later be dissected and analyzed in true crime documentaries, serving as a chilling example of how quickly passion and rage can spiral into uncontrollable violence. The case would become a grim reminder of the destructive power of jealousy and the tragic consequences of betrayal. For Rachel and Mark Thompson and the community of Crestwood, the events of that night would cast a long and dark shadow, forever altering their lives and leaving behind a legacy of sorrow and disbelief. Blinded by rage, Alan grabbed the nearest object, the heavy trophy that Mark had won at a watch-collecting competition, and struck Rachel in the head with it. The blow was fatal. Rachel crumpled to the floor, her life extinguished in an instant. Alan stood over her body, the weight of what he had done crashing down on him. He had killed the two people he claimed to love, all in the name of a passion that had spiraled out of control. In a state of shock, Alan fled the scene, leaving behind a trail of evidence that would soon lead the police to his door. When he was finally apprehended, his calm demeanor unnerved the detectives who questioned him. He denied any involvement in the murders, insisting that the blood on his clothes was from an unrelated incident. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The fingerprints on the trophy, the bloodstains on his shirt, and the discovery of Mark's body in the backyard all pointed to his guilt. As the case unfolded, the details of Alan's confession shocked the community and captivated the public. The story of how a quiet, unassuming man had been driven to commit such heinous acts in the name of love was almost too unbelievable to comprehend. But the evidence was irrefutable, and Alan was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The trial was a media sensation, drawing attention not only to the gruesome details of the murders, but also to the complex psychological dynamics at play. Experts testified about Alan's obsessive love for Rachel, his deep-seated loneliness, and the delusions that had led him to believe that killing Mark would solve all his problems. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had been so consumed by his emotions that he had lost all sense of morality, while the defense attempted unsuccessfully to argue that Alan had acted in the heat of the moment without premeditation. In the end, it took the jury only a few hours to reach a verdict. The evidence was too compelling and the murders too brutal for any other outcome. Alan Parker was sentenced to life without parole, a fate he accepted without much emotion. In his last speech before the court, Alan did not express any remorse for his actions. Instead, he spoke only of his love for Rachel, a love that drove him to commit an unthinkable act. His words made a chilling impression on everyone in the courtroom. a reminder of how dangerous uncontrolled rage and love can be. When the case went to trial, the details of Alan's confession shocked the jury and the public alike. The story of how a quiet, unassuming man had been driven to commit such heinous acts in the name of love was almost too unbelievable to comprehend, but the evidence was irrefutable and Alan was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The case of Rachel and Mark Thompson became a cautionary tale in Crestwood, a reminder that even in the most seemingly perfect of places, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface. The true crime documentaries that later chronicled the case painted a grim picture of a man consumed by jealousy, a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, and a community left to grapple with the aftermath of a tragedy that had claimed 2 lives and shattered countless others. The memory of Rachel and Mark Thompson and the twisted love affair that led to their deaths would linger in Crestwood for years to come.